Hello, welcome to Varn blog. And in light of a bunch of Democratic funding scandals that have come out, both real and some I'm not so sure of, like the particular influencers going around saying there were a bunch of paid protesters in the beginning of the Trump administration, something I can't prove or disprove, but this Trump administration. I've been thinking about the tech billionaire funding of the abundance projects and all the initiatives around that, and the billions in there. I've been thinking about the various dark money, even going to left and radical publications that we have been unable to prove, but see weird patterns in YouTube algorithms and stuff that would indicate backdoor funding through streams, buying bots, buying ads. And then, of course, Kate Willett reporting on the abundance funding, and Taylor Lorentz reporting on the 1620 initiatives and group, which is a super PAC group, and the Chorus project and the opacity around the contracts and vetting that goes into that. And I wanted to get into the Democratic intellectual complex because it's just not true that the center left does not have a lot of real money flowing through it. Although what is funny is how much more stingy they are with it, like $8,000 to pay as a scholarship to media advisors and influencers on TikTok and YouTube. Seems small fry compared to what was being thrown at, like, say, Crowder and a bunch of other people in the conservative media sphere. But the amounts of money are still pretty staggering. But we're not dealing with the money today. You can go check out Taylor Lorentz and other reports about this. We're talking now about the complex around it and how tone deaf it is. Not just in terms of what they advise Democrats to do, but in the talking points around them. When you look at, like, the resistance today, you don't so much have the same kind of things that you saw around BLM and those things, which a lot of the larger BLM organizations also have financial scandals. What you see is a kind of media triad of groups. You have the progressives who seem to be trying to replace MSNBC, but through TikTok. That's like Midas Touch, David Pakman. You have the abundance people who have a lot more institutional clout, Iglesias, Matthew Iglesias, and Ezra Klein. You have the Lincoln Project and Bulwark people who are former neocons, who have a lot of the money from that dissolved apparatus, although if anything, believe it or not, it's actually the last group that it's had the most diversity of the kinds of people they'll engage with, including social democrats. So it's interesting to kind of look at this complex. And this brings me to Jeffrey Lawrence's discussion about this in Avenue of America as a Substack, which I'll link below. And we're going to get into it. Let's say we have to talk about it like the Zoomers say on TikTok. We don't have to talk about anything, by the way, but whatever. We're going to talk about it. So I'm going to pull this article up and we'll do our thing here. All right. So this is an article that came out on August 6th of this year called The Democrat Intellectual Complex. And this is by Jeffrey Lawrence. Okay. In the run-up to last year's presidential election, the best article I read on Donald Trump was written by the New York-based Cuban writer Carlos Manuel Alvarez. Published in the leading Spanish daily newspaper El País on October 30th, Alvarez's article took aim at the mainstream U.S. media's approach to covering the former president and the Republican presidential candidate in the 2024 election cycle. Asterisk. And we see how they respond to this. For example, CBS is putting Barry Weiss in charge of its news project. So the Free Press and all this have just taken over the media. So we can call it revenge of the post New York Times IDW grifter set. And I've seen a lot of media out and stuff like pick up Trump talking points, such as saying Trump has the best approval rating in his second term. And you look at it and it's like, well, one poll that's Gallup says he's got 45% and the others have him down to 37. Now, that's nowhere near the end of George Bush's second term, but it's actually higher than George W. Bush was at this time period. I don't know. I don't know that polls mean anything anymore because the media apparatus and polling apparatuses are A, partisan, B, use very small sample sizes, and C, still rely on old phone calls, so tend to oversample the retired. And what I hear about, Zoomer politics, other than it's highly gender divided, is completely all over the place. So I don't know what to make of it. But anyway, we do know what to make of 2024. And so let's continue to go into that. I haven't encountered a single opinion about Trump on television or in the magazines representing the consensus, the conscience of the Democratic Party that isn't dismissive of him or that doesn't seek to expose him as an imposter from a certain vantage point of moral superiority. Asterisk, as I've always said, you turn to moral superiority when superiority on competence is often not there. If that's not that you shouldn't have a moral appeal if you're competent, but the moral superiority gig tends to be something that you do when you can't say that you have other wins that trump it. All right. American liberalism continues to believe that Trump is an error or anomaly rather than admit the obvious. Trump is the system. I mean, that's also true for his fans who think he's anti-systemic. No, he is the system. And now it's very clear that he is the system. The media is capitulating, etc. Although Alvarez did not deny the dangers of a second Trump administration and readily acknowledged that Trump was racist, megalomaniacal, and xenophobic, he insisted that the liberal obsession with differentiating itself from Trump primarily on ethical grounds merely capitulated him into the limelight over and over and over again. His article concluded with an analogy that has stuck with me through the transition period of late 2024 into the first 7 months of 2025. Quote, to see half of the nation trying to annihilate Trump is like watching a body attempting to get rid of its shadow. Ouch. And this is something that's always interested me. Like, I've heard the Bulwark people talk about Trump's authoritarianism, and like now the authoritarians who are relatively diffuse over both parties are now concentrated in one party. Same with anti-vaxxers, same with a bunch of different groups. But none of those groups would have been enough to elect Trump by themselves, including just outright racist. So while all of those things may be very real and very consolidated and partisan by this point, it doesn't actually explain how he got over that hump, except that the Democrats themselves had not that much to offer. And this is something that I think really does baffle people. Now, the Democrats are generally polling lower than almost anything, and yet they're also doing well in elections, which tells me that Trump himself is not very well loved. But what does it say for the brand that they can't do anything, the brand of the Democrats, that they can't do anything about that? And they even go so far as to try to promote people like Andrew Cuomo, who are openly being endorsed and pulled in by Trump to fight someone like Mandani in New York. This is a fascinating problem, and one that indicates that some of the things that I've heard as justifications for the dark money campaigns from the 1620 Project is actually fascinatingly irrelevant, because if you're arguing that you're doing this to have a mainstream opposition to Trump, it's hard to say that when you're actually supporting some of the same people Trump is. Now, do they support Cuomo? It's very the Democratic Party apparatus in New York has been very strange to read. Effectively, most DSA endorsed and progressive and highly progressive mayors have been marginalized in the past. We can see this in Chicago. We can see it in the career of Dennis Kucinich. We can see it the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, because both the state legislatures and the city councils are hostile to them. With New York, it's harder to see what would happen there. The DSA has been frustrated with Mamdani, or the DSA left has been frustrated with Mamdani because he's obviously pivoting towards a more general election posture, which they should expect, honestly. But the question becomes, what can he even completely do without a highly sympathetic city council? And we'll see. I mean, I think we it doesn't matter what I think. I don't live in New York. So the idea that every mayoral race is a national referendum on something is actually kind of hilarious to me. But at the same time, yeah, sure, I would tacitly support Mamdani. I vote for him over anybody else that I would have the option to vote for in New York. But what does it mean? Anyway. Over the past decade, the U.S. liberal establishment has largely converged upon a single overarching objective: to get rid of Donald Trump, which they are not even really good at. From the Not My President rallies of the early 2017 to the actual presidency of Joe Biden, which was launched with the promise to restore the soul of America, mainstream liberals have depicted Trump as an existential threat to democracy who can only be stopped by the Democratic Party. Asterisk. And if you can only vote for one party to stop an erosion of a democracy, then you already are at the point where democracy is pretty damn eroded. But anyway, whatever we might say about the moral rationale for this argument, as an electoral strategy has proven utterly disastrous. In 2024, Trump not only won the popular vote, he also increased his voting share over his 2016 victory across every single demographic except for white men and white women. Even as he spent the first months of his presidency doging the federal government, assaulting the U.S. higher education system, arresting and deporting immigrants en masse in very messy ways. I mean, mass deportation of immigrants have been kind of going on for a long time, and continuing to support the genocide in Gaza, the Democratic Party's favorability plunged to the lowest it has been since the partisan polling began in the early 1990s. And largely, that unfavorability has plunged not just amongst the general public, but also plunged independents and the left of the Democratic Party. In the wake of Zohran Mamdani's stunning victory over the establishment candidate Andrew Cuomo in the New York City mayoral primary, and the ongoing revelations about the party's cover-up of Biden's cognitive decline, the mainstream media has finally woken up to the reality of the party's decline. In recent months, the New York Times published an op-ed with the headline, "Biden is a scapegoat, the Democrats are the problem." The Washington Post mockingly and thus revealingly proposed to rack up a list of the 3,515 ways in which Democrats are lame. And the New Yorker asked, do Democrats have a plan? Which, they don't. But anyway, as usual, independent media have provided the most pointed critiques of the party's structural problems, which is part of why you've seen this push into progressives fighting an influencer culture. They're not fighting Joe Rogan necessarily, although that's part of what they're doing. They're also fighting the organic frustration of youth activists on the left with their own party. Which range from elite deference politics of its leadership to the corrosive role of policy clientele groups at the heart of the coalitional project. And at the same time, in LitHub, Viet Thanh Nguyen has criticized the complicity of the cultural institutions and the bipartisan support for Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, and in Harper's Magazine, Panka Mishra has spoken of the total capitulation of the politically neutered literary intellectual elite. And I don't love Mishra all the time. I've done episodes on him about 10 years ago, but he ain't wrong on that. And it's a bipartisan problem, actually, but it is harder to sell to the Democrats, who even took better stances on this, even though they were pretty damn bad in the Obama administration. However, I have yet to see an account that fully connects the decline of the Democratic Party with the overall decline of intellectual life in the U.S. sphere since Trump's election in 2016. Are the Democrats to blame for anti-intellectualism? Survey says probably not, but they're not innocent either. Even though many of us recognize that Trump emerged as the wrong answer to some of the right questions about bipartisan decay in the United States, and also economic decay, power's going to go up, unemployment's going up, the trade deficit that supposedly sparked all these tariffs is actually getting worse because you can't piss off the people who buy your raw goods and expect them to still buy them. The military alliance is screwed up. As of today, Trump is complaining about Russia and India siding with darkest China. It's really sad. As a critic of the American Empire, I find this just more funny than anything else. But it's sad to live through. I mean, people I know, including in my own life, have been being laid off, and that's in a society with a declining workforce. So if you think about the fact that the population was already dropping out of the workforce, and there's key sectors of which we are still very understaffed, particularly in healthcare. We kind of are in education, but that's going to correct itself, which is what the longue durée plan always was. You're like, oh, what do I say longue durée, Varn? Well, I've been saying that they've been hoping that the population would drop to fix education, and that's why they didn't want to really fix it for a long time. And now they just don't care. All right. The case I'll make here is that those who inhabit the liberal cultural institutions that currently dominate U.S. intellectual life, the news media, publishing, and the academy, have engaged for the past decade in a form of shadowboxing, relentlessly attacking Trump and the Republicans while weakly and selectively pushing back on an ever more indefensible Democratic Party structure. And I would actually say they co-opted a lot of Trump's politics from his first term, only to have their co-optation of those politics enable Trump to pivot away from them. And to more right-wing stuff. Trump is more incoherent now than he even was back then, but he's also more purely himself. He's a demagogue figure. All right. One of the most important takeaways will be that many punitively progressive journals, writers, and academics have played an essentially conservative role in reinforcing the ossified structure, especially insofar as they have used what Alvarez describes as the moral superiority of the anti-Trump movement to provide for cover for Democratic leadership that has lost whatever credibility it once had. And I think you even see this today. All three of the major factions I've talked about in the progressive or anti-Trump media ecosphere, the former neocons, the progressives, and around Chorus and the abundance people, they've all called Trump a crypto communist because of his interference into the markets, not just in terms of tariff, but also in terms of buying portions of stock or threatening to renationalize the defense industry, which I don't even know why we wouldn't support that. I find this fascinating for a variety of reasons, and I really do dislike the Trump administration. Do not get me wrong on this. I think they're basically lawless, but I think most of the administrations have been increasingly lawless for a long time. Yes, there is a difference in kind and a difference in extent, but the seeds have been laid there for the last century and only increasing every single administration. The dangers of the Trump administration are real, and the journalists, writers, and scholars enumerate them every chance they get. See, I agree, they are real. Nevertheless, it is my belief that the most urgent task for progressives right now, I mean, I don't care what progressives do, but I guess maybe we should give them some good advice, is to analyze how the nexus between the Democratic Party and the liberal information system in the United States has conspired to thwart the flourishing of a genuine progressive movement. And what we've been learning since this article was written about the way dark money works in the Democratic Party, and I don't think Chorus is actually even the worst offender by far. It's just the one that's the least obvious because you can bypass all these election laws that ironically Democrats put in place by funding them through social media. But I find the fact that instead of trying to deal with this problem, even after this article came out, what we've seen is that just been trying to manufacture a new base that doesn't really have a lot of genuine support. I mean, Midas Touch did surpass Joe Rogan briefly in the kind of thermostatic reaction to the beginning of the Trump administration, and that's historically what has happened. You've had groups be able to, relatively minor groups that existed for up to a decade before, pop up and influence in response to an overreach in the ideology of the other side, the perceived other side in the United States. I'm going to emphasize perceived here. But this is often deeply astroturfed, and for all the complaints that things like the Tea Party 15 years ago were astroturfed, and they did become so, this is starting out astroturfed. I mean, I would also say that parts of the Black Lives Matter movement went from organic to the astroturf, and the organic parts have been largely forgotten about, are pushed to the side by both radicals and a lot of the very people who astroturfed that movement and picked up their talking points cynically to try to reappropriate them. All right. A true revitalization of the intellectual sphere, good luck with that, will not just require us to move further to the left. It will require us a definitive break with the party apparatus that ultimately acts on behalf of a tiny sliver of a liberal oligarchy, most of whom are over like 75. That will necessitate a direct confrontation with the logic of the Democrat intellectual complex that, since the beginning of the general election campaign in 2016, has treated systemic critiques of its partisan structures as a form of distraction, if not outright betrayal. Dude, the way college journalists on football from Ohio have insulted me for even taking anything Taylor Lorentz says seriously and just saying, okay, if you wanted to debunk that, you could just produce the contract redacting any crucial doxable information, and no one's really done that. I mean, you have David Pakman pretending like he doesn't know how to say APEC. But anyway, let's begin by assessing the role of journalists in this complex. The mainstream media coverage of Trump's rally at Madison Square Garden serves well for this purpose, in part because it allows us to compare the assertions made in U.S. legacy outlets to Alvarez's far more trenchant analysis in El País. The first rally gained mainstream attention because it represented Trump's boldest campaign foray into deep blue territory. He wasn't just returning to his hometown, but to a city he had lost by 53 points in 2020. And the pre-event coverage, which largely appeared in conservative outlets, focused on the fact Trump had sold out the 19,000-seat Manhattan Arena within minutes and seemed to be generating enormous enthusiasm in a place where he was not expected to do well. In the wake of the rally, however, the majority of coverage was on the liberal side, with much of it focusing on comedian Tony Hinchcliffe's tasteless joke in the opening set, referring to Puerto Rico as a floating island of garbage. In the days that followed, a steady stream of denunciatory pieces appeared in the legacy media outlets. Trump at Garden, closing carnival of grievances, misogyny, and racism, New York Times. Trump loyalists spew racist, vulgar attacks on Harris and Democrats at New York City rally, CNN. Trump rally speakers lob racist insults, call Puerto Rico land of garbage, Washington Post. And as the headlines makes clear, these articles describe the rally almost entirely in moral terms, leaving to the side the fact, as Fox News emphasized in its own account of the day, both the stadium and the surrounding area were packed with Trump supporters. I'm far more sympathetic to legacy media framing of the content of the event's speeches and which in my eyes were vulgar, misogynistic, and racist. And there's no question that Fox News better captured the political significance. In the election held 2 weeks later, Trump improved in his 2020 results in New York City by nearly 20 points. The op-ed that the New York Times columnist Jamal Bowie penned is after the Trump Madison Square Garden rally. Trump is less confident than he says. His rally at Madison Square Garden proves it. Epitomizes several basic interpretive errors that progressive journalists commit in their capacity as mainstream political analysts. Although Bowie acknowledges at various points that Trump had the crowd he wanted and is not necessarily headed for defeat, he nevertheless asked with the sinister smugness of the New York op-ed crowd. And look, I like Jamal Bowie a lot better than I used to, but Bowie is like a deep product of this culture. Not as bad as Matthew Iglesias and other like really scummy products of this culture, but nonetheless. Whether Trump's message is ultimately that of an undisciplined candidate who believes that his day in the spotlight are coming to an end and wants to make the most of them before he can no longer claim this kind of attention, in the final paragraphs of the op-ed, Bowie goes so far as to say, watching a lackluster rally headlined by a rambling pratter of a tired candidate struggling to capture the attention of his audience, it is clear that neither he nor his movement has juice. I know what failure looks like. Really? Do you? Seems like you guys don't. At Madison Square Garden, I saw it on display. The confidence with which Bowie refers to Trump's campaign rally as a failure just weeks before Trump won a decisive victory continues to amaze me. It is more symptomatic than anything else, is Dewey's thoroughgoing refusal to distinguish between his own reaction to the day's speeches, which were indeed dark and disturbing, and his assessments of their political ramifications. There's a whole lot of apologists as projections, and it's not just elites to do it. All right, you confuse your moral valences with your political and ethical analysis, you're going to be bad at both. From the moment that Trump shocked the liberal establishment with his victory in 2016, the rhetorical bait and switch has been the dominant approach of progressive New York Times columnists who have repeatedly entertained the idea that X move by Trump or Y decision by the Democrats will be enough to finally banish MAGA from the national scene. Probably not. Rather than engage in honest assessments of the on-the-ground political reality, these journalists resort to endless exercises and ideological risk fulfillment. Alvarez's article demonstrates that the mainstream American journalists could draw vastly different conclusions about the events like Trump's rally in New York. They simply exist in an information economy that incentivizes them not to do so, and sometimes literally pays them not to do so. Alvarez wrote a piece for the leading legacy outlet in Spain merely underscores how narrow the range of acceptable analysis in legacy media is in the United States. And honestly, even in a lot of progressive TikTok media where audience reinforcement or dark money will keep you from really dealing with anything. Such that insulated American liberals can now look back on the tangential logic of their intellectual elites and act as if their interpretations were the only ones on offer. Even now, the mainstream media, liberal media, has yet to come to terms with the glaring fact that Donald Trump built his electoral coalition by strategically incorporated renegade Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Elon Musk, people that Democrats created. I know you don't like to hear it, but it's true. Alongside Republicans who owed their national platforms to the legacy media's early effort to position them as palatable alternatives to Trump, we recall that a 2016 New York Times review of Hillbilly Elegy called J.D. Vance a fiercely astute social critic of the sort we desperately need right now, even though Vance has basically only been a patronage seeker his entire political career. Probably even when he was at a state school in Ohio. I mean, not probably, definitely. Trump is a singular figure in the recent U.S. political history precisely because he was able to navigate the impossible path from the New York elite to the heart of the heartland-dominated Republican Party. I mean, to be fair, the Bushes did that too, from Connecticut to Texas, but, that's been the story for a while. Reagan did it as well. That's what these, executive figures in the GOP have done now since the collapse of the Nixon era Republican Party coalition. Trump is Trump not because he rejected coastal American liberalism, but because he took its most toxic elements, the ivy-bred faux populism, You see that in his cabinet. How many people who are complaining about the Ivy League, and they all have Ivy League fucking degrees. The superiority complex, belief that politics is performance, emerged them with the most toxic elements of modern Republican Party. Reaganomics. Yeah, for people who said neoliberalism was dead, they were full of shit about what Trump was going to do. He just made neoliberalism in one country. Christian nationalism, anti-minority policies, etc. The legacy media's continual outrage over Trump's escalating authoritarianism speak to the real action he's taken, trying to run the country by executive orders with no regard to the Constitution, because why does it matter anymore? The courts can't really enforce anything anyway. But it also serves to distract from how much he owes to their own brand of performative politics. I mean, anti-wokeness is a mirror image of wokeness, even in its grievance searching. One of the many shortcomings of Ali Abbasi and Gabriel Sherman's 2024 biopic about Trump was that, in contrasting Trump's origin with the almost entirely around notorious conservative bad boy Roy Cohen, it evaded the serious consideration of how the New York media and entertainment industry turned Trump into one of the most recognizable people in the United States, not just with The Apprentice either. I knew who Trump was when I was 15 years old, and I knew him as a failed businessman made famous by people like Gerardo Rivera. As novelists from James Joyce to James Baldwin have taught us, fiction can challenge the organizing logic of the societies in which we live. That's a bit idealistic. This is where your progressivism showed through, friend. Yet it also can serve to reify the status quo, which is usually what it does. It's mostly what it does. Although the U.S. publishing industry has sought for the past decade to portray itself as the righteous defender of truth in the age of manipulation, the reality is that the most acclaimed U.S. novelists in the age of Trump have adopted the same liberal apologism that has captured the mainstream legacy journalism. In recent years, critics and scholars have skillfully identified the various aspects of this problem, from the rise of the trauma plot and the representation trap in the contemporary novel to the broader turn towards sanctimony literature in the literary field. I mean, I think we're finally seeing that kind of go away, but not really. And it's pushed a lot of edgelord creators who were left-wing in the early aught teens into being total reactionaries, just straight up. On Substack, the editors of the Metropolitan Review have criticized American culture machine serially devoid of risk-taking, and Naomi Kanakia, I don't know how to say her name. I read her Substack, though. Has rightly observed that the most literary works praised by the hype machine seem predigested. Not prestige. Although they're basically the same thing now. Prestige just means midwit. It is rarely pointed out, however, that the feature that most clearly aligns the celebrated novels of the Trump era, regardless of race, age, or gender of their authors, is that they have fully internalized and thus relentlessly narrativized the principal talking points of the Democratic Party. For one of the many virtues of Nicholas Goskell's recent scholar essay on Trump panic fiction, which I should read sometime, is the emphasis he places on the sheer number of American novels of the late 2010s and early 2020s that directly incorporate Trump into their fictional universes. I mean, even as a poet, I had Trump slapped on the cover of my first book in 2016, when my first book was actually about the Bush administration. And it was a poetry book. It's a cryptic, but I wasn't writing about Trump hardly at all. In fact, I finished the book in the desert in 2017, and I wrote most of it in 2008. All right. From Ben Lerner's Topeka School and Ayat Akar's Homeland Elegies to Patricia Laughlin's No One Is Talking About This, which everyone's fucking talking about this. It's such a fucking lying framework. And Lauren Oyer's Fake Accounts. While I agree with Gaskill that the ostensible goal of these novels has been to combat a figure who composes his reality through fiction, I will maintain that they have simultaneously used the rhetoric of anti-Trumpism to shore up the Democratic establishment against its ruin. As I've said, even the far left, for a long time, and by this I meant through the Bernie campaign, until 2020, gave an anemic Democratic center lifeblood by making it seem like they would ever incorporate any of their ideas. Now, they'll use AOC as a breath of hope, get them out on an anti-oligarchy campaign, everyone will show up and feel good about it, and it won't change a damn thing they do. Lerner is arguably the most famous of these writers, and he's a good poet, but also the best-known representative of what we might describe as literature's Occupy generation. Slightly too old to be part of the millennial left, he was born in 1979. I was born in 1980, and I've been told I'm part of the millennial left, and I'm a fucking Gen Xer, so who knows? He nevertheless belongs to the influential groups of poets, writers, and intellectuals who politicized by the emergence of Occupy Wall Street in the fall of 2011. I am too. I am the fail son of this world. That's how I came about. Having already established himself in his mid-20s as a poet working in the line of John Ashbery in the New York School, that's how I first knew about Ben Lerner and actually liked him. And fresh off the success of his irreverent autobiographical novel, Leaving to a Station, Lerner published a long article in Harper's Magazine in 2012 that ended with the allusion to the People's Mic, a practice of collective speech invented in Zuccotti Park in the early days of the original Occupy encampment. I made fun of that at the time. I feel smug now. All right. The article, which detailed Lerner's experience in high school competitive debate, of course he's a debate kid, provides a snapshot of the arguments that literary progressives were making at the end of Obama's first term, when the belief in the possibilities of what M+1 dubbed left populism, which you still hear people try to convince themselves is going to fucking work even in Europe, remained alive and well. Left populism has always been a dumb idea. The article contrasts the slow speech of the Occupy movement with the rhetorical and intellectual poverty of the presidential debates between Obama and Mitt Romney of the national discourse of both parties. And Ben Lerner wasn't wrong about that. Although I would say he probably overestimates the slow speech of the Occupy movement and clearly outlines the disastrous effects of the neoliberal consensus politics embraced by the Democrats as well as the Republicans. You guys weren't expecting me to go into poetry with today, were you? You just thought I was going to complain about Democrats. But no, poets are very guilty here. Remember when I used to interview poets and the late Sam Hamill just wouldn't stop using America things. And I'm like, what good is it if you're trying to win people over by just insulting them all the time? Like, it just doesn't make any sense as a strategy. It just seems like you're not actually interested in politics. You're interested in making yourself feel good. The lightning-fast trades of the bundled debt, the remotely controlled drone strikes, the oil flowing into the Gulf. In 2012, Lerner plainly understood that while the nation's ills could partly be blamed on the new right of George W. Bush's Solar Palin and the passionless nationalism of the Midwestern white boys, responsibility for its economic and political decline also needed to be apportioned to the supposedly communist president who oversaw the greatest consolidation of the capitalist class power in the country's history. Yes, he did. BlackRock's power starts in the Obama administration. The contracts that enabled a lot of the tech moguls to become the billionaires they are now happened under the Obama administration with government contracts. See SpaceX. Look at how profitable a lot of Musk's ventures were before that. And look how long it actually took the Democratic establishment to turn on them. It took a long time. The problem, to borrow again from Alvarez, was the system. A very different national allegory appears in Lerner's most recent novel, The Topeka School, published in 2019. The work follows Lerner's auto-fictional avatar, Adam Gordon, through his adolescence in Kansas and his late teenage years before jumping into the last section of the present for the first Trump presidency, where we find Adam living with his spouse and two young daughters in New York City. Yet, in this version of the story, high school debate taxes do not mirror public speech that conceals financial chicanery and imperial overreach of the United States, but rather a crisis in white masculinity and its representational regimes. So this turn went from a turn on the external and material failures of the United States and its empire to the moral failures of the citizens of said empire, by people who were often of the very demographics they were criticizing. The early parts of the novel contain some of Lerner's best writing to date. I'm particularly partial to the scenes narrated by his mother Jane, and do delve into the difficulties of the white working class Midwesterners faced during the neoliberalizing eras of the 1980s and early 1990s, where, as a Southerner, I saw a lot of that myself. And I'm sympathetic to Ben Lerner for that, but I can't take his liberal horseshit conclusions very seriously any more than I can take J.D. Vance's moralizing and neoliberalism very seriously back when he did it in Hillbilly Elegy, even though he was accurately describing white working class Ohio's or semi-lumpenization. He was. No one liked it, but he was. Now, the conclusions and moralizing he throws in there are total horseshit, and he also hides, the advantages he got to get him where he is, both, in the Ron Howard movie about him, which was critically kind of panned, wasn't actually that bad, but it was just that deceptive. And in his book, after all, it helps to have a senator like you because you were a non-infantry enlistman in the military. Doesn't mean that he wasn't competent and worked hard. It just still means he hid that he had help, and of course he did. But the Topeka School eventually resolves into a relatively straightforward moralizing tale about the need for white men of learned generation to reject the temptation of MAGA conservatism, represented by Adams' debate coach, Will Evanson, who would go on to become a key architect of the most right-wing governorship Kansas has known, an important model for the Trump administration, and by Darren, Adams' troubled white working class classmate who appears at the protest and at the end of the novel wearing a red baseball cap. It is not until the final chapter of Topeka School, however, that the novel reveals how deeply it is resolved Lerner's 2012 critique of the bipartisan political discourse into the problem of angry white men proclaiming the end of civilization. The funny thing is a lot of these liberals would say that about me and my complexity thesis, just like a lot of leftists think when I mention decadence, I'm being moralizing, even though I'm not talking about morality at all. Back to this. The novel concluding scene find us at an ICE office in New York, where Adam, alongside with his bilingual spouse and daughter, engage in protests against Trump's separation policy with other immigrants' rights activists. And at the end of the novel, replete with the rhetorical and physical violence of white men, Lern repurposes the lines that conclude his 2012 essay of the rallying cry for the emerging anti-Trump resistance. One of the organizers stood back on a stone bench and yelled, "Mic check," and we all yelled it back. Oh, that's so fucking pathetic, Lerner. I like Lerner as a writer, but I mostly know him as a poet. I don't read a lot of modern literary novels because I find them moralizing liberal schlock. But whatever, this proves why. The human microphone, the people's mic, within those gathered around a speaker repeat what the speaker says, not order an amplified voice without permit requiring equipment. It embarrassed me. It always had, but I forced myself to participate, to be part of the public speaking, a public learning slowly how to speak again in the middle of the spread. This final scene does not simply represent Lerner's symbolic abandonment of the message he took from the imaginary of Occupy Wall Street, namely that grassroots attempt to enfranchise the disempowered citizenry should target corporate sponsors of the entire political machine. It also enacts a sharp pivot away from the kind of progressive framing that would allow him to see Trump's victory not as an either-or proposition, but as a combined result of white backlash and the decimation of the country by bipartisan embrace of neoliberal governments. Yeah. Can we say both and instead of having liberals pick the moralizing one so that we can't talk about anything serious ever? Not that racism isn't serious, but it absolutely is. But for example, you don't fix racism by taking a lot of international students to meet diversity quotas that you later call DEI quotas that you've diverted funds from programs that used to be aimed at local inner city kids, but since they are harder to make successful, cost more to make successful because you haven't fixed the schools in the area, and you're really just interested in increasing your overall endowment anyway, well, why the fuck would you do that? Because even though you might get cred for helping these poor kids out, they're not going to be endowers after they graduate. And you won't be able to use that to increase your rent portfolio in your city, as particularly the big universities are often the largest landholders and rentiers in their respective cities. See NYU and Columbia for New York. From this perspective, the NARML's formal decision to skip over Bush and Obama administration doubles as a political refusal to engage seriously with the actual historical process that led to Trump. It just makes it about bad dudes doing bad things. Well, why were they incentivized to do bad things, bucko? In respect, it is hard to see the social diagnosis of these last scenes of the Topeka School as anything other than misguided. Both Adam and Lerner lead us to believe the answer to Trump and his MAGA movement will be to reform white men's subjectivity from inside out. And as reality would have it, though, Trump's return to power in 2024 is fueled by his ability to attract non-white, non-college educated voters to the Republican presidential ticket. This is like progressives who jump on Kristen Sinema, even though she'd already betrayed before she even did that, because of her early things in Occupy, are people who jumped on Fetterman because he dressed like a worker, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if anything, the progressive political instincts have either been to valorize losers after they lose from multiple election rounds, are to empower people who instantly betray them because they have a very superficial understanding of the aesthetics of politics. And don't even get me started on what's happened to most of the squad. They're not all useless. They're not all bad. I like Rashida Tlaib. But in a certain way, they have been a control opposition. And a very tone-deaf one. If Lerner's Topeka School offers us a portrait of how white male writers could play their part in joining the liberal anti-Trump resistance, Valeria Lucili's career demonstrates how immigrant writers from elite backgrounds could leverage their personal histories to shift blame for the nation's anti-immigration practices from Obama to Trump. Born in Mexico City in 1983, Lucili began her career as a Hispanophone writer, publishing 3 literary works in Spanish before switching to English, the language in which she wrote the nonfiction book Tell Me How It Ends, an essay and 20 questions, and the critically acclaimed novel Lost Children Archive. The former was released in 2017, just a few months after Trump's inauguration, and its main plotline tracks Lucili's experience as a volunteer interpreter for the Central American migrant children facing deportation in New York City during the so-called refugee crisis of 2014. It is a true story about the injustice perpetuated against migrant children by ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, and the judicial system under the President Obama, referred to by the immigration activists as the deporter-in-chief. Astonishing, however, Tell Me How It Ends recounts the events that take place during the middle years of Obama's second term in office. His name is mentioned in the book only 3 times, while the 5-page coda written in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election mentions Trump's name 7 times. In a clear exposition of the logic of the Democrat intellectual complex, Lucili somehow converts an essay that is entirely about applying immigration policies of the Obama into the invective against Trump. History itself would demonstrate the fallacies of this argument. According to all reputable sources on U.S. immigration, Obama deported more people in his first term in office than Trump did in his. During the timing of the publication of Tell Me How It Ends helps explain this jarring break in the essay's rhetorical structure. While the main portion of the essay acknowledges the bipartisan origins of the discriminatory 21st century U.S. immigration system, including the long history of U.S. intervention in Central America that has acted as a push factor driving its people to seek asylum in the United States, the election of Donald Trump evidently lessened the demand for this type of critique. Although it doesn't seem unreasonable for Lucili to have recalibrated her depiction of Obama administration with Trump and his xenophobic policy plans looming on the horizon, the form of recalibration exemplifies the conceptual incoherence of much of the anti-Trump literature. Early in Tell Me How It Ends, Lucili criticizes the mainstream media for characterizing the refugee crisis as an institutional hindrance rather than seeking to understand it from the point of view of the children involved. And by the time we arrive at the coda, however, Lucili's focus has shifted from the migrant children to a group of pro-immigrant college students in a class she is teaching the semester Trump wins. In the final pages, she claims, if we manage to pull through in the next years, it'll be thankful to the young people who are willing to give their minds and hearts and bodies to make change. I was so tired of hearing that shit in the Biden administration because it was never true. I could have told you it was never true because I dealt with Gen Z kids. I was told over and over again how progressive they were, and I'm like, the men are not. And there's very clear divisions in that generation, even more than there are millennials. And while people like, oh, now Gen Z is super conservative, again, millennials were predicted to be super conservative too in 2005 to 2007. It didn't happen. Reality hit them in different ways. But how they have conceptualized that reality, going from fail sons to comfortable fail sons, has really changed the perception of the millennial left as not people who are trying to critique the Democratic Party, but are either trying to take control of it or just trying to keep it in control, even though they're empowering the very people they admitted caused the problem in the first place. Yes, I feel betrayed by the people immediately under me in an age cohort and the people above me, but I never really expected much from other Gen Xers in the first place. And these generations are only material conditions because of the events that have happened around them are material, not because of any inherent generational character. Bah! Anyway, back to this. The illusion here is subtle but decisive. Having spent most of the book proposing an experiment in imaginative empathy with undocumented immigrants, she ends by elevating a we that consists of U.S. citizen and green card holders like Lucili herself. We might say that in order to offload responsibility for the migrant situation from Obama's Democratic administration to Trump's Republican one, Lucili must figuratively forsake the very children on behalf of whom she claims to be speaking. And a bitter irony, many of those undocumented children are likely have been deported by the time she wrote the coda in early 2017. They were never subject to Trump's administration system because they were no longer in the United States. Ouch. Luiseri's own status as a cosmopolitan member of Mexico's elite is crucial to our understanding of her rhetorical strategy here. Luiseri's father is a well-known former Mexican ambassador, and she spent much of her childhood in a privileged global Anglophone spaces, including South Africa and India, places I used to teach and see this kind of liberal elite emerge. In a sense, Luiseri's ability to speak on behalf of the migrant children derives from her shared identity position. In the language of the U.S. liberal establishment, both poor Central American migrants and wealthy Mexican elites are Latinos, despite the enormous chasm in class, privilege, and immigration opportunities that separate them. And I've been mad about this for years. I've been mad about people like talking about how letting the richest people, the most privileged people of these groups speak for the very poor for a long fucking time. And Tell Me How It Ends, Lucille bridges that chasm by weaving in her own narrative about the migrant children as a side plot involving a bureaucratic snafu that prevents her from receiving her green card on time. Yeah, it's totally the same, bro. Just like it would be totally the same if I talk about what happened to me in Egypt, where I was stripped of my work visa, but was allowed to stay on a tourist visa by the government knowingly. Somehow the same as what happens to people getting deported today. That would be absurd, and I would not do it. It does give me some empathy for their lives, but it is not the same at all. All right. And Tell Me How It Ends, Lucille. Midway through the essay, she turns this temporary loss of status into a narrative motive for writing about the children. It was thanks to my lost green card and thanks to my lawyer abandoning my case that I became involved with this much more urgent problem. My more trivial pursuits as an alien writer, our pending Mexican, took me into the heart of something larger and more important. In the textbook case of what Olafume Towiho, I follow this writer. I read his Elite Capture book, etc., etc. And I think he's actually too soft on the Democrats' elites. I think some of this was captured from the beginning. Has done Elite Capture, Louise converts her situational precarity into a justification for her speak on behalf of a group far more precarious than others. What is crucial to recognize here is how deftly the identitarian sleight of hand feels into the democratic intellectual complex. Just as Tell Me How It Ends concludes by shifting the focus of the narrative from the undocumented migrants to the author's students, the responsibility of the migrant crisis from the Obama Democratic administration to the incumbent Republican one, so too does it convert Louise herself from a figure into a figure of resistance, whose irrigation of the suffering of those migrant children achieves symbolic closure through her call upon citizenship-bearing Americans and green card-holding president residents to pull together in opposing Trump. Funny how that all works. And this worked on a lot of people, by the way. Luiselli's next book, the 2019 autofictional Lost Children Archive, ratchets this disavowal of the Democratic culpability with remarkable efficiency. Retreading much of the non-fictional ground covered by Tell Me How It Ends, including Louis Arias' experiences as a volunteer translator and the road trip she took with her then husband to an immigrant detention center in the U.S. Southwest. I refuse to exploit my stuff in Mexico for this shit. If I ever write a novel like that, you can call me out. Really call me out. The novel further elaborates this material from the Obama era into an allegory of life under Trump. As with Lerner, her recycling of her early essay proves revelatory of the ideological work. In one scene of the novel, Louise directly repurposes her main charge against Obama from Tell Me How It Ends, namely that at the height of the refugee crisis in 2014, his administration created a priority juvenile docket that allowed it to expedite the deportation of undocumented minors. The main difference between the essay and Lost Children Archive is that, while the former identifies the culprit as the Obama administration, the novel removes the references to Obama so that the sentence reads, the administration, backed by the courts, just announced the creation of a priority docket for undocumented minors, which means that the children who are arriving at the border were the priority in being deported. One might grant Louis the benefit of the doubt here, arguing that the effacement of the proper name speaks to a novelistic desire to abstract the general conditions from the specific situation. And indeed, literary critic Alexander Marshall has read Louis' intention in Lost Children Archive in just this way. Though Lost Children Archive resembles recent historical fiction, he writes, the aim here is to ground the novel in deliberately ambiguous and ongoing present. Yet the interpretation just doesn't hold up in my eyes, in part because virtually every other aspect of the novel speaks to Louis Sayre's attempt to transpose the Obama-era events of the novel onto the age of Trump. In the first place, Louis Sayre characterizes the mistreatment of the migrant children not as a structural feature of rent-seeking, an imperial state that degrades the humanity of migrants and poor Americans alike, but as the expression of an irreducibly white supremacist country that dislikes those migrants because of the color of their skin. I mean, both could be true, but that's kind of irrelevant. Like, one is purely moral and the other has other implications. In line with the depiction of Trump voters in the liberal media, the novel traffics in the most pedestrian of stereotypes about people who inhabit the so-called flyover states. During the passage describing Front Royal, Virginia, for example, the narrator remarks, presumably in reference to a country song, that white supremacist something is playing full blast in the gas station. The lines are supposed to be funny, but the humor doesn't land, mostly because one gets the sense that Louis Sayre does in fact believe that the term white supremacist should be applied to anything about the U.S. South that her narrator doesn't understand. Of course, this is by no means to imply that white supremacy or systemic racism has ceased to be endemic features of the U.S. political and cultural and social life. It is to assert, however, that the novelists such as Louis Sayre and Lerner have exploited their topicality in the Trump era to efface the marked continualities in the practice of the Obama and Trump administrations on the issue affected minoritized populations in the United States. It should come to no surprise that Obama himself rewarded Lerner and Louis Sayre for their energies on both fronts. Both Topeka School and the Wall Street Archive appear on his list of the best books of 2019, which, if we go back to the beginning of this essay, he puts up here. And man, I like it funny, like that he likes Shoshana Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism, because that's that okay book. But I don't really believe he read it. And everything else here seems pretty damn midwit. You're like, how dare you insult? Yeah, I'll do what I like. Anyway, let's get back to here. All right. To a degree, my analysis of Lerner's Topeka School and Louis Sayre's Tell Me How It Ends and Lost Journal Archive dovetail with that of Viet Thanh Nguyen's aforementioned Lit Hub piece, which argues that the most contemporary American writer is at once vigorously anti-Trump and compliant with liberal imperialism embodied in the administration of Joe Biden and Barack Obama. I fully agree with when that contemporary American literature is plagued by this kind of low-level dissent that can be promoted by Obama in his annual list of recommended books, which flatters writers and provide literary sheen that obscures Obama's extensive use of drone assassinations and deportation of undocumented immigrants. Yet Nguyen's piece also makes a curious carve-out for the American minority writers, whom he claims speak and are expected to speak in terms to highlight the contradictions of the status quo. This seems more convenient than compelling to me, as we can see from the brief consideration of the career of Ta-Nehisi Coates, whom Nguyen singles out as notably anti-imperialist writers of color in the current moment. Yeah, I for those of you who don't know, I was really impressed by Coates' early days, but then I realized he was making right radicalism safe for centrists, and also proposing things that he had no intention of dealing with, while making a really milquetoast politics crafted primarily for white progressives in coastal cities seem more racially liberatory than it actually was. But anyway, I did actually kind of think that he was brave in the Message book, and I do think it was courageous, and so does his author, and so I want to get to that. Coates' long essay on Palestine and Israel in his 2024 book, The Message, does indeed present a deep and courageous challenge to the biparty consensus, but it took Coates a long time to get there. In his 2017 book, We Are 8 Years in Power, which ends with a sympathetic portrait of Obama on his way out of office, its title embodied the tendency amongst progressives, including many African-American progressives during the first Trump presidency, to make peace with an administration of which they had often been critical. Yep. And I got told to do that too. Michael Brooks told me to lay off my Obama criticism for a while. We never agreed on that. In 2016, Coates himself was harshly criticized by Adolph Reed and other black figures on the left, who argued that the former's objections to the Bernie Sanders platform in the run-up to the 2016 election had helped the centrist of Clinton and Obama wing of the party consolidate their power. In his earlier writings, Coates had spoken of Reed as one of the few public intellectuals he truly admired, and it's to his credit that he took the left criticisms of the work to heart rather than rejecting it. I will say that Coates is a figure, even though I came out against him, who has impressed me more with age, but I still feel pretty good about how he acted in the second Obama administration. Even though I think he's a great writer, and I do think we can criticize him, even though he was radicalizing. After he wrote his book on Obama, he basically just wrote comics for like 3/4 of a decade. In a 2024 interview with Ezra Klein, one of the few New York Times columnists who shows interest in some version of the truth, although some version is interesting, we'll see what I said about the abundance funders and Klein's relation to them, and read Kate Willett's article in the New International about that. Coates spoke with an admirable honesty about his shifting relationship to the liberal establishment, saying that after he wrote his major pieces for The Atlantic during the Obama presidency, he realized that the kind of person that was going to be in this kind of journalism that I wanted to practice was probably going to have a certain set of politics, not just around Israel and Palestine, but in general. And he points in particular to the favorable views he expressed about German reparations to the state of Israel in the case of reparations, an essay what put him on the map. I remember reading that essay and finding it very compelling until I thought about it and was like, I don't know that it's actually going to do what you think it's going to do. But anyway, I did think it was an interesting moral argument. That the practical argument is what got me under. He arrived at the anti-Zionist view for which Wynne commended him, not because he's a minority writer, but because he made a conscious decision to change his position on the controversial issue, which he knew would put him at odds with the dominant bipartisan view. And also kind of stayed out, when he did this, he kind of stayed out of politics for a long time until he felt like he couldn't anymore. I mean, Ta-Nehisi Coates went away for a while. Now, I want to give Ta-Nehisi Coates credit for being brave. I mean, as far as like early aughts Obama backer, progressives, he's one that went from I thought was a hustler to I actually think he's a brave writer. I wish he'd have done this sooner, but better late than never, although as a friend of mine says, better never late. I increasingly feel that the moment has come to push back on claims like Wynn's that minority writers are inherently more progressive than white writers, in part because, as the theorist of race has never ceased to tell us, whiteness itself is a historical construct. Although Wynne mentions Kafka and claims that Kafkaesque is an apt description of the minority experience, it is impossible to figure out where Jewish writers fit into the binary schema. Anti-Zionist groups such as Jewish Voice for Peace have been among the most committed activists for the pro-Palestine movement of the past year, and Jewish writers have been at the forefront on public efforts to disavow the long-standing link between Jewishness and the state of Israel. Are Jews minority writers when they adopt anti-imperial positions and white writers when they adopt Zionist positions? Obviously, it's easier to adjudicate claims about minority status when Jews and other right-adjacent groups are not at the center of cultural conversation, as was the case before October 7th. But the liberal fantasy that the right-wing representation of Jewish identity politics we've seen in the past 2 years can be defeated without directly confronting the forms of identity essentialism that currently dominate our cultural institutions. The notion that one's racial, ethnic, gender, religious, and sexual identity determines one's ideological perspective solely was always false. It does have an influence, but it's not sole. And the cynicism on which pro-Israeli Jews have demanded sole right to determine what constitutes anti-Semitism only serves to highlight the flaws of a discourse embraced with increasing fervor by progressives in the age of Trump. See Afro-pessimism. Indeed, although the literary establishment often defends its embrace of diversity against MAGA attacks on the grounds of equity, in reality, it is that its criteria for inclusion is far more ideological than identity-based. There is no question that Christian Rupinian's viral 1970s story Cat Person rode the wave of Me Too, and Susan Choi's Choi or Che. I think I'm going to say Choi because she's in America, but Che is what that would be in Korean. National Book Award winning 2019 novel Trust Exercise, which revolves around older men exploiting young women in art schools in Texas, also clearly derived momentum from the debates around institutional gender violence that arose in the context of the movement. But what about Hernan Diaz's Trust, which took the Pulitzer in 2023, or Justin Torres's Blackouts, which won the National Book Award in 2024? Are these also Me Too novels? One can certainly make the case. At the end of the Diaz novel, we learn that the true genius behind the tyrannical financier, Andrew Bevel, is his midwife Mildred, while Torres's novel concludes that a reflection on the real-life story of how homophobic early 20th century psychiatrist George Henry cribbed his influential study of non-normative sexual practices from the lesbian researcher Helen Reitman. Nonetheless, to group these novels together as a narrative response to Me Too movement would miss the complex interplay between the movement's cultural politics and the determined anti-Trump logic of the liberal establishment. Although the concrete detonator for Me Too was undoubtedly the Harvey Weinstein scandal. From the very beginning, it is also metonymically associated with Trump, who entered the presidential race in 2015 with multiple accusations of rape and sexual assault, whose Access Hollywood comments condoning sexual misconduct ignited a firestorm in 2016. One does not have to make light of the real concerns raised by the Me Too, suggest that those concerns were often mobilized towards partisan ends. Witness, for example, the extraordinary difference between Time's Up overwhelming support of Christine Blasey Ford when she accused the conservative Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh in 2018, and the group's staunch refusal to fund Tara Reade when she made a similar accusation against Joe Biden 2 years later. Yeah, that bothered me too. In truth, the discourse surrounding Me Too was always intertwined with liberal arguments about the role of gender in the outcome of the 2016 election between Trump and Clinton, more specifically the claim, voiced over and over again in the liberal media sphere, that internalized misogyny in the American public was the only way to explain how a man without any political experience could have defeated a politician whom Obama and the Democratic Party leaders described as the most qualified person to ever run for president. What qualifies a person for run the president? Being 35 and winning the election. I hate to say it, that really is what it is. Credentials don't come into Democratic politics, and when they do, it's like treating it like it's a corporate job. However one feels about the validity of the hypothesis, it is impossible to dispute the liberal establishment's zealous commitment to it, as endless circulations of the enemy of Donald Trump looming over the Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential race in the mainstream media outlets attest. In this context, which unites Rapinian, Choi, Diaz, and Torres, is not their gender, race, or female body experience of male dominance. It is their adoption of a certain view of male power that dominated the legacy media in the age of Trump and came to function alongside with white supremacy and Russian influence as the Democratic Party's primary mechanism for explaining Trump's victory in the 2016 election. And some of that stuff may have been true. I mean, Russian influence is vastly overstated, but it doesn't explain all of it. No of these explanations really do. And gaslighting people about the economy, which is undoubtedly getting worse, by saying that, oh, it's just partisan and Americans just don't know what they're experiencing, has always just struck me as absurd. Now it's going to get worse. None of the things that Trump promised to do has, as far as the economic response, has he done, nor would the things he promised to do it ever made sense to bring about what he was saying he was going to bring about. But nonetheless, we shouldn't too coquet here. Basically, everybody's been gaslighting everybody. And I use gaslighting specifically, which is to make you feel like you're crazy and focus you on one side or the other, not just lie. To call attention to the family of his emergencies is not to dispute the quality of these prize-winning writers' work. I consider Diaz, Choi, and Torres to be amongst the most talented writers publishing today. It is to claim, however, that their narrative rehearsals of this crucial Democratic Party talking points about male power cannot be divorced from the extraordinary success of trust exercise, and blackouts in the contemporary literary field. And also why literally almost nobody reads these books. Like, they don't sell well at all. It is not an accident. The most explicit displays of gender aggression in these works come in the final chapters, where they serve to dissipate any lingering ambiguities over the characters' motives. Choi's trust exercise and Torres' blackouts are virtuosic in the reconstructing complex dynamics that govern romantic relationships and significant age and power gaps. Although, again, this has gotten weird because a lot of progressives have been celebrating younger Zoomer women dating middle-aged millennial men because of the perceived politics of the men in both groups. So everyone seems to be full of shit these days, and no one believes in anything. But and they are supremely alert to the role that interpretation, perspective, and military play in understanding such dynamics. In my reading, however, they both achieve narrative resolution by symbolically rupturing this textured relationality in favor of a univocal ending. In Trust Exercise, spoiler alert, we definitively learned that the male headmaster of the school is an abuser. And Blackouts, another spoiler alert, we find out that one of the earliest histories of clear sociality has been supported by a misogynistic monster. The post-2016 locus classist for the device is undoubtedly Cat Person, where one-word text message horror is sent to a young woman. Protagonist definitively dispels the ambivalence that the reader feels towards the male character, who has been treated somewhat sympathetically up to that point. And of course, one could cite several counterexamples to the sensationalistic denouement and fictional work in the past 10 years. The conclusion of Mary Gaskell's extraordinary 19 2019 novella, This Is Pleasure. Mary Gaskell is amazing, by the way. People should read all of her books. This is my favorite fictional expression of the labyrinthine complexity of the Me Too moment. Yet it's undeniable that a more visibly, recognizably anti-Trumpian iterations of that narrative have achieved greater visibility in the literary field in terms of coverage, prizes, and praise because of who funds the universities. Let's be fucking honest about what this is. All right, the democratic intellectual complexes, and this is why I don't buy the left. By that, you mean Democrats don't have money. It's not true. The Democrats raised more money in the 2024 election than the GOP did and still lost. The Democrat intellectual complex has been arguably taken root most deeply in the academy, and that is not surprising. Although public funding for higher education has declined for decades and continues to decline rapidly, even before Trump, Republican assaults on university have accelerated rapidly over the past few years, and humanities have increasingly found themselves in the crosshairs of the second Trump administration. And they found them in the crosshairs of the first and the right during the Biden administration, and the Biden administration didn't do much about it. As anyone who works in a university knows, the assertions of radical Marxism of the humanities are greatly exaggerated, not because those who endorse radicalism are Marx in short supply, because the gaps between the discourse and action are substantial. Yeah, people can talk about Marx all day and they don't do shit. Indeed, the major professional organizations in humanities largely align with the liberal progressive wing of the Democratic Party, and faculty unions, including my own, often openly endorse Democratic politicians in primary and general elections. I don't think we should be endorsing people that are caveat of what they should agree to, regardless of their partisan affiliation, but that's just me. There are obvious benefits to this practice. It gives university and union leaders access to the halls of power, and it certainly amounts to leverage and influencing local, state, and national policy. However, it also runs the risk of vitiating the agency of faculty, staff, and students, as well as college administrators who have been established an ever more dependent relationship to the Democratic Party apparatus. To see the effects in action, let's consider Rutgers University, the flagship institution of the state of New Jersey, where I'm employed in the English department. Oh, that's unfortunate. In recent years, despite having a Democratic governor in office, Phil Murray, whom our union endorsed in general elections of 2017 and 2021, the university has witnessed one of the most troubling periods in its history. In April of 2023, in the face of the unprecedented intransience of the administration of Rutgers President Jonathan Holloway, our faculty and graduate unions went on strike for the first time in the university's 257-year history. Not only did President Holloway repeatedly disparage unions' efforts in direct communications to students, he also threatened to seek an injunction in New Jersey courts to have the strike declared illegal. Two actions that form the core of no confidence resolution passed by Rutgers Senate later that year. In response to the strike, Governor Murphy took an unprecedented step of inviting the administration and the union to the state capital of Trenton, where closed-door negotiations took place over 5 days before an agreement was reached. Both President Holloway and the union leadership praised the intervention of the Democratic governor, as well as an active member of the union as an active member of the union at the time, though I wasn't then nor now authorized to speak on his behalf, I believe it was the right decision to accept an invitation at the stage of negotiations. You have to negotiate. But the larger question remains, should have been the norm for universities to either accede or appeal to the Democratic Party officials to resolve their institution's internal issues. What kind of expectations does it create for the university administrators, and what leverage does it create for Democratic politicians? How does it play optically to the general public? The issue with Rutgers finances that led to the 2023 strike is by no means resolved by the successful resolution of contract negotiations. Earlier this year, Governor Murphy, who is in the last year of his second term, abruptly announced in his proposed 2025-2026 budget a budget cut of $65 million to Rutgers University system. Now, I want to say this because these budget cuts are coming from Democrats, and they're not being talked about because of the budget cut coming from the feds and from Republican lawmakers. You always can use the enemy as a smokescreen, right? Once again, intense pressure from the university, this time and combined effort by the administrators, faculty, staff, and union leadership furthered the proposal. But with a tough election looming in New Jersey in 2025, and the best bet for Rutgers being centrist Democrat Mikey Sherrill, the outlook for the future is anything but certain. At what point will it make sense to transition to a more adversarial politics towards the coming administration, regardless of its partisan affiliation? More broadly, at what point should the faculty, staff, and graduate students and U.S. academic institutions demand real autonomy from the Democratic Party apparatus and the university administrators who so often capitulate to it? These are genuine questions, not rhetorical ones. Is it a truth of our current moment that the Democratic Party often represents the only electoral alternative to the Republican Party, but it is no less of a truth that without enormous outside pressure, Democratic leadership continually undermines the very cultural institutions they claim to be defending. What is to be done? I have years that flow directly from my analysis above, but they are neither demands nor prescriptions. They are conclusions I have reached as an individual after inhabiting these liberal cultural institutions for nearly 2 decades. The first and most obvious idea is that progressives must start seeing the current Democratic Party leadership as an enemy rather than an ally, which they already are, but there is a countervailing tendency to try to fight that. The extraordinary cynicism that mainstream Democrats and liberal media have exhibited in their attacks on Zohran Mamdani is the tip of the iceberg. As has become clear from the actions of Christian Gillibrand and other party leaders who endorsed Cuomo for mayor after demanding his resignation as governor, the Democratic establishment of 2025 adopts the tenets of progressive movements as Me Too and BLM only to the extent that these movements further their interest, and they abandon them when they don't, and they did during the Biden administration pretty thoroughly. They have no problem turning against those principles when power is at stake, and they'll even ignore the fact that Trump is endorsing Cuomo. And they will directly oppose protest movements such as the one against the genocide in Gaza if it touches any kind of ideological third rail or proposes any real structural change. I'm not saying that progressives must abandon the Democratic Party altogether. I am saying that, but not Jeffrey here. As someone who voted for a write-in and third-party candidate in the 2024 election, I did too. But nonetheless, plans to vote for Mamdani in the fall. I don't live in New York, so I can't. I don't think a dogmatic approach to electoral politics will yield results I'd like to see. I don't either, even though I'm not saying the third party is an answer. I'm actually saying you need institutional independence that's willing to go all kinds of ways until you have your own party. And you can't get your own party just by calling it into existence. We're a party. No, you're a sect of weirdos. Sorry. That said, I do believe that progressives should work towards the creation and maintenance of an autonomous cultural and political institutions and push back decisively against cynical attacks on non-aligned institutions by the Democratic politicians. We must be aware that the Democratic Party has been the main culprit in eliminating third-party participation in blue states over the past few decades. Yes, they have, by the way. It's not been the Republicans, although Republicans do have the best argument for having actually lost an election because of a third party in 1992. The Green Party was not on the presidential ballot in New York in 2024 because Cuomo backed 2020 bill to raise the voting thresholds for small parties in statewide elections. If we are unable to see analogies between the Democratic Party's effort to maintain a two-party system and its current duopolistic form and its efforts to disqualify thought that defines the bipartisan consensus, we condemn ourselves to supporting the very structures we are slowly bringing about our own demise. You make yourself captives to a politics that is not in your interest. Sorry. End of discussion. The correlated movement away from unqualified support for the Democratic Party is to wean ourselves off legacy media in favor of independent journalists and information outlets. Actually, that hasn't worked because they realize that it's even cheaper to buy those off. I mean, this is the part of this. This is the part of this is the most progressive and naive. In navigating the worlds of academia and New York literary culture over the past decade, I've been surprised how many progressive writers, scholars, and journalists limit their consumption of political information to hate reading mainstream liberal outlets. Thus, although they are fully up to date on the issues that divide the Democratic Party, most notable being Israel-Palestine, they have little knowledge of other issues that drive independents, leftists, or conservatives. They lack the outrage amongst writers and academics of the mainstream cover-up of Hunter Biden's laptop, even though it wasn't, it was a cover-up, people. The refusal to confront the Biden administration's deliberate efforts to undermine negotiations in the war in Ukraine are the only two most glaring examples of how wedded most U.S. progressives are to liberal news channels associated with the Democratic Party. Most of them are failing because they're a failing demographic. And just to be clear, the mere fact that one does not get one's news directly from the mainstream liberal outlet does not mean that one is not beholden to their framing, since the algorithmic logic of social media largely replicates the partisan structures of the rest of U.S. society and also has partisan dark money on both sides flowing all through it. And also dark money from other places, other countries, all kinds of stuff. As progressive intellectuals, I'm not a progressive intellectual, I'm a Marxist. We must sustain effort to seek out a range of alternative media sources and evaluate their ideological frameworks. And I hate everybody. No, I can't. Now I'm going to be more critical of Lorentz here. As a major part of the problem, as I discussed in another post, is the small magazines that come to prominence in the aftermath of Occupy Wall Street have gradually been absorbed into Democratic intellectual complex. Actually, I think he's right here. I agree with him on Jacobin, like hard, maybe more than he does. And I have friends at White for Jacobin, but I'm not backing down on this. The editors of N+1 have almost entirely adopted the resistance framework of the party's progressive wing, and you don't hear about N+1 anymore. I haven't heard N+1 be relevant in a long time. I used to complain about him on Former People, a show I did with the conservative literary world back in the day, before that guy was even fully conservative yet. But they haven't been relevant for most people for quite a while. And the expansion of Jacobin Network in the more mainstream media, the founder, editor, Bhaskar Sankar, now is president of the Nation, which literally consolidated my claim in 2015 that Jacobin would become the Nation, although they did it faster than I thought they would, because the Nation also had similar radical origins. This coincided with the magazine adopting the practice of taking shot after shot at the Democratic Party politicians without seriously positing any alternative to it. The tried and true Jacobin formula: if the Democrats were only able to do X, but then they still want you to vote for Democrats because the other side's worse. And don't tell me that this has been a problem with the Derick Brad left. They hate Joe Biden, but they can't deal with the institutional donor complex that emerges in that world. Catalyst magazine, published under the auspices of the Jacobin Foundation, remains one of the most consistently thoughtful sources of leftist critique in the small magazine sphere. It's kind of a theory journal. As its editor, Vivek Chibber, once made clear in interviews, he is skeptical of the possibility that the left can produce political organs independent of the Democratic Party at the moment, and for better or for worse, the magazine's editorial politics continue to be defined by the logic of Western liberalism. And I've always thought Chibber was wrong on that. And if he's right, he needs to be part of the solution to how we get out of that instead of just capitulating to it. And there's not going to be any ideological Ackerman dirty break any more than there was a political Ackerman dirty break, for those of you who remember your DSA talking points from 2017. Ultimately, I don't believe there's anything wrong with reading any media source, including mainstream and liberal and conservative ones. I do. I read all of them if I can get my hands on them, if I have time. Although the only reason I subscribe to New York Times is because I want to know what the establishment liberals are thinking. Yeah, New York Times sucks. The problem with the Democratic intellectual complex, as I see it, is precisely that it has winnowed the possible avenues of thought about contemporary politics and culture to the tiniest elite determined lanes. And they've done this often from people who've complained about this very party. Even a lot of the, quote, dirtbag left capitulated to the Democratic Party. We should be honest about the fact that nobody has an answer to a political predicament, and that disciplining intellectuals according to existing formulas will impede rather than encourage the possibilities for change. That also applies to weirdo leftist groups, by the way. Fortunately, the rise of a heterodox left podcast sphere over the past decades has made it easier for those who seriously contemplate the ideas of new political formations may arise to meet the current moment's needs. The podcast I find most helpful in framing this possibility is Bad Phrase, hosted by Bernie Sanders, National Press Secretary, and Ivy League graduate Andrew Gray. The podcast is notable for a range of perspective it offers for contemporary politics, from the left of the Democratic Party to the ideological center. Until 2024, Gray also co-hosted the Hill's program Rising, where conservative and populist right-wing guests appeared regularly. Just in the past few months, Gray has been debates with Billing, debates with Chibber, with former congressional representative Jamal Bowman, with socialist politician Kasama Sawad on third-party voting, not to mention with Francesca Fiorentini and Dave Sirota on media coverage of the Democrats, with Craig Mahibar and Asel Rad on geopolitical roots and consequences of the genocide in Gaza. I mean, like, look, Bad Faith is a good show if you are used to NPR and you want something that is radically more inclusive and different and has a lot of different point of views. But it's still from that world. Heterodox left is pretty lightly used there. It's still an elite product. And I'm not saying this because I'm jealous. I actually kind of like episodes of the show, and I think I'm glad Beyond Joy Gray exists in this otherwise tepid-ass media landscape. Particularly on the progressive side. But the idea that independents are going to really do this, particularly when you see how much money is going in to create a Democratic talking point independent media from all kinds of different sources, and that there is a lot of money going into it, and it's justified in, like, we need real money to fight the Republicans. But the problem is a lot of the same people are funding both sides. And that brings us back to the very thing that Ben Lerner and the Occupy people were complaining about a decade and a half ago. I admit I listened to Gray's podcast in part because I agree with their basic stance on the Democrats, which is, as she recently put in a conversation with Schroeder, that the party's leadership's greatest talent is that, and that what they're most efficient at is putting down any kind of left-wing insurgency. Well, they're not even that good at it because Frank Luper and George Gray exist, but that's what they're most devoted to. They'd rather lose an offer even in the smallest compromise to the left. That's true because they think the left should be captive to them and that they can grow moving to the right. And from a gain strategic standpoint, that's going to be true until the left is willing to be independent of the Democratic Party, period. However, it does not seem to me that one has to agree with the assertion to appreciate the urgency of the widening political debate beyond its mainstream ideological parameters, and including now from a shibboleth of Jacobin. Ouch. During a heated debate over the limits of bipartisan system between Gray and Bowman, a key member of the squad who was primaried in 2024 was criticisms of Israel. That's not. I mean, he was also not a good. He was primary to that, but he was not a good retail politician. The reason why AIPAC devoted so much money for going out after Bowman and Bush was that they were really, really, really vulnerable in ways that Tlaib and Omar and AOC were not. AOC played both sides in all this, but Tlaib and Omar actually took even somewhat better stances than Bowman and Bush, definitely than Bush. And AIPAC couldn't do anything to them, and they didn't try. All right. So people go, well, AIPAC spent all this money and it defeated them. I'm like, well, yeah, but what they're buying is the loyalty of the person that replaces them. There were internal problems that both of them made. While Gray was extremely versed in the internal dynamics of the Democratic Party, Bowman seemed unfamiliar with the basics of any third-party organization besides Working Families, whose organization efforts have largely been reduced to endorsing progressive Democrats, including Bowman himself. Honest conversations about the viability of our institution should not be seen as a threat to political progressivism, but as a sine qua non for its continued existence. Even those who vote blue no matter who should be able to articulate why they continue to make that decision. At the broadest level, overcoming the democratic and intellectual complex will also necessitate a greater openness to among U.S.-based scholars, writers, and journalists who have been collaborating with the left in other places across the globe. Far too long, American progressives acted like they were the vanguard of the international left, conveniently forgetting that they take the view in part because they are in the center of a global hegemon. Given the current administration's position, U.S. universities, publishers, and media organizations will likely cease to operate as hubs for scholars, writers, and journalists from around the world to the extent that they have been over the past several decades. And that's probably not going to get reversed anytime real soon. That's me adding up. As painful as that decline may be, the silver lining is that American intellectuals may finally wake up to the reality that they inhabit a multilingual and multipolar world, and have for at least 2 fucking decades. I mean, and for a multilingual world, for fucking ever. On the way, alongside with the right-wing movements that are currently sweeping across the globe, there are glimmers of new kinds of left politics on the horizon. Time will tell whether Corbyn and Zara Sultana's Your Party can break Britain's own duopolist oligarchy. That's not looking so good right now, even when Keir Starmer is like one of the worst politicians in fucking history. But its extraordinary rise in the past few weeks serves as a potent reminder of the overwhelming discontent that voters have expressed with the establishment liberalism again and again in Europe and the global South. However, just like in France, it's probably going to be an indicator that the far right is going to actually do the thermostatic thing and seemingly claim the anti-systemic thing and come to power. Whether or not they're anti-systemic is actually anti-systemic is hard to see, but they will break shit, and that means they're actually doing something. Which I'm not saying that as a good. I don't endorse just breaking shit for breaking shit's sake, but there's a reason why people keep on getting attracted to that, and why left populism has not really worked, because it won't really oppose it very thoroughly. We saw that. I mean, like, we can talk about Your Party, but I mean, this author is not bringing up the failure of Syriza and Podemos, the battles within what led to the creation of France Unbowed, the destruction of the French Socialist Party, although Hollande is still not gone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Increasingly, we are witnessing the last gasp of liberal political, economic, and cultural paradigms. I've heard that for 2 fucking decades, man. There will either see displaced to authoritarian right populism, or still be a articulate left coalition to finally fight for the 99%. This is where I really like this author's analysis, but I want to say this is way too optimistic. A left coalition needs to prepare to not just fight for the 99%, to actually offer a different fucking vision than just populism. Because people don't just want what they want. They also want people to help them know and learn what they want. And they want people who will be accountable to them, not just people who pander to them. And left populist failure over the last 15 years should make that obvious. No more LeClau. However things shake out, there will be no return to the welfare state liberalism to define the American century. I mean, it only defined like 1950 to like 1992. So, you know, like, so you really mean the second half of the American century, aka the baby boom, who was so egotistical about it as a cultural elite and the richest generation in America that ever existed on the fucking planet, that they literally convinced everybody that their conditions were the conditions of the entire fucking century, which they were not. They were only conditions of part of the second half, but nonetheless. Midway through his account of Trump's October 27th, 24th rally, Alvarez paused to observe. One could say that the United States, assuming that the United States is its institutions, has not understood Trump or understood him too well and is not in a position to stop him, because doing so would mean stopping themselves. I actually think the latter is probably true. Perhaps through a political reform that is beyond the historical possibilities of this country, whose very existence is close to a miracle. There is no room in the mainstream U.S. discourse on either side of the political aisle for a vision as clear-eyed and sobering as Alvarez's. One that takes seriously the idea that in order to move beyond Trump, Americans would need to fundamentally change their attitudes towards themselves and towards the rest of the world. And they're going to have to one way or the other anyway. And, you know, if we don't get ourselves into either a Thucydides trap and go to a war with a major power and accidentally destroy the world, or divide up in civil wars by 1,000 cuts until the functional country's already departed anyway. And even though there's no clear civil war break, the country doesn't have the impetus to maintain itself and falls apart. There are other possibilities, but those are not non-zero anymore. And I think people should really think about that. But I do believe that unless we recognize that we all bear some responsibility for their decline, and that in a meaning way, Trump says, we will continue to fight the enemy outside while ignoring the enemy within. We have found our enemy, my friend, and it has always been ourselves. All right, this is me engaging with the progressives. As I said, I mostly agree that particularly its literary analysis, although I think it's a little bit too optimistic about the way progressive money actually functions in independent media too. I do have to think, I think bad faith and Chapo Trap House is gateway drugs to more heterodox left things. But we've seen a lot of those things capitulated. I'll give Brianna Derick credit. She hasn't yet. She also hasn't become a right-winger yet, where a lot of the other former dissident left has all but in name, or actually just has. Resentment drives a lot of political momentum, and people come up with weird ideologies to justify their resentment. I'm going to say what I've been saying now for 15 years, and for 5 very loudly. If you want to be independent, you have to actually be independent. If you want to build a party, you have to build the institutions, infrastructure, and stuff that would predate that party. You can't just call it into existence for ideological necessity reasons. If you want to get in politics, it's about more than what you fucking believe. I'm back. Despite this, I'm pissed. My families are poor. The world is more fucked. There's more conflict. There's more conflict. There's more oppression than the global south. But you know what? And oh my God, is this country run like a basket case? But you know what? We did this to ourselves. And not just our enemies or the corporations, although they are primarily responsible. And I'm tired of shitting on the working class for its own problems. It's problems that we should acknowledge and admit and not romanticize, which a lot of these right progressives who talk about the working class all the time do and don't deal with. Yes, we have to deal with that. We have to talk about honestly, and it's going to be ugly. But like when progressives like, there's no male loneliness epidemic or whatever, I don't even know what to do. You're just trying to decide who is worthy of the oppression that they get, and so that's progressivism. Meanwhile, People who've commented about this have just gotten frustrated and joined the other side, even if they haven't officially done so. Apostates are one thing, but traitors in your midst are another. And I'm not a left purity kind of guy. I think we should have a broad tint, but there's some things you have to figure out what we can and cannot accept. This has been a longer episode of Radical Engagements. I'm recording it on the day it's being released, which hardly ever happens. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of other stuff about independent media scandals and these other things that have come up. I just want to tell you all that you need neither Trump derangement syndrome nor Trump normalization syndrome. And have a good day. Protect your peace. We're going to need it. I'd like to thank my new supporter level patron, Thomas R. Thank you for your support. The sponsor tier. And the rest of you, have a good day.